about UX for a
I
second.
was just going to say that. You beat me to it.
Yeah. All right. So am I still sharing my screen?
Yes,
Okay, good.
we are recording now.
We are recording now. Yeah, that's great.
So a bunch of stuff that Stephen said, and now here we are on mental models.
Right. So just to give some context for anyone who's just joined us, we are running a workshop on design for resilience, and we are exploring at Miro board, exploring the ideas of agora, the gathering space of the original experiment in democracy in ancient Athens, and famously in ancient Athens, where the ecclesia would meet in the agora, the gathering space. So what I've just come from is an exploration of the Bauhaus and how they were looking for ways of understanding the materials that they were working with so that they could understand how that fits into their architectural program of understanding the materials and then actually practicing and enlarging their understanding of their craft as they went into the workshops in weaving, tapestries, graphic design, interior design, and architecture. So in the current context, we are exploring how design is evolving from maybe creating ways of building architecture for the built environment, or maybe even focusing on how do we create digital systems that interact with the devices and tools that we're using every day, the computers, the phones and tablets. So as we think about those really complex systems that we're designing for as UX designers, I happen to be a mentor with a program called Design Lab, where we offer a course in UX Academy. So it's helping people make a transition in their careers to becoming user experience designers. As part of that process of becoming a designer, we work with something called personas. And that's a way to become more empathetic to what is going on in the perceptions and cognition and motion and actions of the users that we are serving with our products and services. But what I was wondering about was whether the persona has too much of a bias towards maybe the advertising and marketing and public relations fields, where they're using big data sets to track people and be able to understand their behaviors and motivations. So what you might find within that system, if we take a look at this mental model that I was able to create, it's focusing on how things are built out of nested systems. So if we think of ourselves as human beings, as a part of nature, well, what is nature? We start, first of all, with maybe Einstein's theory of relativity, where energy is a factor of time and matter. So E equals mc squared is this famous equation. So I've put that at the center of our reality. But outside of that reality grows this awareness of our selfhood and consciousness. So we're just through cognitive science becoming aware of an understanding of our biochemical pathways that manifest as somehow consciousness. We're not sure exactly how that's happening, but we're at the frontiers of being able to delve into that understanding. So here we are with this awareness of consciousness, understanding that there's a memory of the past, a present awareness of something happening in our senses and our cognition as we're interacting with what we're perceiving as ourself and with the surrounding environment. And we can also project into the future ways that we can predict what might happen based on what has happened in the past. So there's this really interesting way of okay, well, there's now, remember at the beginning, I was using some psychological priming and using the number 3 as a way of framing everything. So as a way to communicate across the divide between maybe people who are more liberal and maybe looking for ways of expanding their horizons, where there's another way of being in the world, which might be a little bit more conservative, where a sense of fear might want you to be more protective or maybe even hide from threats or want to be able to maybe eliminate threats. So there's, out of this sort of sense of values, where if you start with your conception of yourself building out of a sense of fear in your environment, then that's going to lead to feelings, emotions that are driving your motivations into feelings of success. You know, how do I find success? How do I, you know, if I have this feeling of being an imposter, how do I gain the sense of being a master of my environment? But if everything's building around this feeling of scarcity, then that's what's going to be driving your motivation, is how do I find success? If everything is about fear, then you want to take as much as you can from the environment so that you can survive. So what you're doing is focusing on dominance and competing within that that environment, and then that drives a sense of focusing on the self, where it's about thinking of survival and building strategies. The focus of your consciousness is on basically, how do I succeed and maybe even just survive in a very hostile environment. So that's going to lead to, as Jesse James Garrett was talking in a presentation called Design for Engagement, about the idea of how you can separate human experience into these 4 different pieces: perception, cognition, emotion, and action. And as a user experience designer, he was using an example of designing for some games that you can use a controller, and it can throw your balance off when you're looking at a large screen and you're in a really immersive experience. So what you're needing to recognize as a designer, you need to take into account all of these different parts of human experience. So perception connects to mind, perception connects to the 6 senses or at least 6 senses. So sometimes we forget, we tend to think about 5 senses: taste, touch, see, sight, hearing, and smell. But we often forget that the ear contains 2 senses, hearing and balance. So there's the equilibrium is being controlled by that additional sense there. So it has a lot of bearings as a UX designer when you're realizing the games that you are creating, or even the VR experiences, if you put on a headset, might throw off your balance. So it becomes a really important thing to be aware of as you're designing. So out of that sense of self and fear and taking whatever you need from the environment, it's going to drive whatever behaviors are going to manifest on the outside. So as we go from this boundary line from perception, what's going on internally, we're going now into the external world of the self, where your behaviors are manifesting through your cognition in driving towards seeking intelligence and surveillance, extracting property and ensuring the security of that property, and then consuming whatever you can from your environment through aggression and expressions of power. So if you build these sorts of things into social systems, now we're crossing the boundary line between the person into the social system that these behaviors are being manifest into. And so if your cognition is driven entirely around an interpretation of fear and scarcity, then you're probably going to be creating artifacts that revolve around creating hierarchies and ideologies and propaganda. And then you're in the mode of extracting, from certain populations in your environment through developing industries that are exploiting the resources of a particular territory. But as you're consuming those resources, you're also wanting to make sure that you're protecting through power and aggression, building borders and walls, maintaining military forces, and engaging in violence and war. So the systems that we've created as human beings to support this kind of behavior is a sort of social identity that is built around orthodoxy or religious systems that enforce moral authority and a particular set of values. And this is driving a compliance in the motivation of large populations of people within certain territories. So the behavior that is being sought is a loyalty maybe to the corporation or to an economic system of growth. So it's all about business efficiency in this case. And then as we think about how this manifests as maybe embodied political systems, then it's about enforcing the strength of a certain political status quo through the building of nation states, or even being able to build a sort of government structure that can use its superiority of resources and capital and violent power to make sure that the whole system is working according to the basic value systems that are driving this engine. So the processes that are involved are control, protection, destruction of enemies. And so what I'm exploring here is that there's different things that are happening at the core. So you'll see that there's these three dividing lines between the core experience of being human, and then there's an internal experience of being human, and then there's the external effects of how those social systems work when everyone's driving with the same engine. So if we move beyond this to see how these core values turn into internal perceptions and motivations and behaviors and then affect the external environment, why don't we take a different look at the way I'm training young designers is thinking of themselves as more in a collaborative mode where we're trying to make sense of our environment in a way that instead of, sometimes we can go into animal instinct where we're going from perception to straight to the stimulus response, or you see a stimulus in your environment, you go straight to the response, and then you rationalize that with a story or an interpretation of what just happened. But if we drive the engine in a different way, if we're going from stimulus to interpretation, so this comes out of cognitive behavioral therapy. If you want to make better sense of your environment, then you want to make sure that you're not being driven by your innate biases. So when you go from stimulus to interpretation, you're actually making better sense of where is that stimulus coming from? How do I need to respond to that in a more rational way? So you create that interpretation and then you respond to it. So that's what's driving the engine of design, is we need to better understand our environment before we move ahead with any kind of response. If we go straight to response, then we're acting out of the limbic system essentially, rather than the prefrontal cortex, where our rational thinking drives us towards what Daniel Kahneman calls system 2 thinking, rather than system 1 thinking, which would be more an instinctual response to an environmental stimulus. So then as designers, what we're doing then is focusing on how can we be people of vision who are exercising our will and effort in the process of finding ways to influence our environment. So how do we become people of influence who have agency and capacity to be able to imagine, design, and build the future together? Okay, so now we have a completely different engine that is running in a different direction towards vision and values, brand identity, story. This is how we as designers are creating a personal brand, but then it has ways of taking our values and intentions and then moving them out into the real world in ways that we can now think about, well, how do we build a website, for example? So Ruta I was just involved in one of her events yesterday where she was teaching people about how do we build websites. And we have amazing technologies that allow us to build content strategies and create marketing strategies around that content that can drive our connection to social media. And from there, we are able to build our relationships by offering services that meet the needs of the people that we're serving, by creating products and web applications or native applications for our devices. So what this does is drive an engine of trust. What is branding? Well, branding is really just an expression of how you're building trust with the people that you're serving. And it is through this sort of virtuous cycle of starting with a core value of intention to serve rather than with an intention to exploit, which might be the other engine. So this is going to be the thing that leads our process then as designers, is this scientific method being applied to creativity. So you have hypothesis, experiment, and results. And we go through a process of ideation. So we find inspiration, and we do that through researching and developing concepts. What we're doing is trying to find out, well, what kind of needs do we actually need to satisfy through the products that or services that we're creating? So you want to find something that is desirable and feasible and viable. So this is coming out of the model of IDEO. IDEO has a methodology that they've been evangelizing for a while called design thinking. So it comes out of this concept that you need to have something that meets a human need, that is technologically feasible, and can create a viable business model. So that's going to mean that you're going to drive some research to find inspiration for concepts that are the foundation for the prototyping stage, where you're going to create those prototypes, test them as you're taking your ideas from from just the world of cognition into the real world, where you can find out, well, what works and what doesn't. If you don't know that, then you're just guessing, according to Tom Chi. So look into his rapid prototyping talks on his TED Talk. He's all about rapid prototyping. So once you get past the prototyping stage, now you're into the realm of actually building and deploying your products. And so we're into the implementation phase. Essentially what this does is, as we're looking at this entire mental model, it's building social systems that inspire, empower, and sometimes I replace this word with celebrate. Celebrate the accomplishments of your team, but we can also express that as, in the same way that Bucky Fuller was saying, well, what is metaphysical gravity? Metaphysical gravity is, or love is metaphysical gravity. So here, the engine of the process that we're that is driving our creativity is, how do we imagine, design, and build the future together? So in the Design Science Studio, our intentions are to make a world that works for 100% of life. So what I want to do in this this exploration of the mental models for human experience, if we click on this particular card on the Miro board, what you'll see is this little icon that comes up where you can click on the source, and it's going to take you to a web page. So here we come to the mental models for human experience. It's an article that is the shorter version of what I wrote back in December, but it goes over this whole idea of how this was inspired by the Bauhaus, and using the idea of the evolution of ideas, dividing everything through this design for engagement presentation by Jesse James Garrett, where he's talking about cognition, perception, cognition, emotion, and action related to the senses, mind, heart, and body, and the different models that we can go into, where there's everything that drives our intentions is about creating stories around, well, how do we make sense of life? It's usually by gathering around a fire and looking back at where we came from through stories, and projecting into the future through stories. Where could we go? So a lot of what we're working with these devices maybe came through speculative fiction from Star Trek, for example. And so I go into, explaining the different models here. So anyway, so hopefully that gives you a good overview of what we're trying to accomplish in this workshop. And I know we're probably going way over the 45 minutes, but first of all, I just wanted to maybe invite some questions, or maybe some comments from Stephen and Brad on whether that kind of model makes sense to them.
Sorry, what were you saying? We were chatting.
Right. I'm sure I've lost everyone at this point.
No, you've actually got everybody tracking with you. The conversation is pretty rich in the chat. So I'm eager to actually have this as a conversation.
Great.
One of the things that's come forward is the concept of trust. And I'm going to call you Stephen and you Stephen, just to keep everything straight.
You can call me Steve for the purposes of today.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Steve. Steve, can you talk about some of those things? Can you flesh out what you've been talking about trust in there? You've got two neat concepts about default trust and that sort of sense of authoritative trust too.
Right. So not every human, because there are sociopaths in the world, a small fraction of humanity, but most humans tend to have a default trust mode. And I wish I had the research with it. This actually came out of an interview I did with Wendy Vanguard, and we both came out of an abusive religious system. So basically what I was talking about is there are certain roles that we create within society that we sort of collectively accept, such as, you know, a firefighter or a priest or a preacher, a minister, someone who by default tends to get the trust of society. And so we buy into those systems. It's kind of like what I was reading when Stephen was talking about UX, where we all show up to a website expecting to use it a certain way. So we come with that inherent bias or model of how things work, and then we step into that, and it doesn't matter how it actually works or what's actually going on. That's how we try to click the button. We're trying to make it work the way our we've been conditioned to interact with it, or our experience has dictated that we should interact with it. So if I'm someone who grew up in a household where I don't trust the clergy, then I don't come in with that default trust. So that's where we end up getting these differences in society, because people come from, you know, these different shared agreements that we collectively have. So not to tangent too much, but I love to do that on my show, as Stephen already knows. When Stephen is talking about these different models, and there are multiple models, you can apply this to a lot of different things, but on one model, you have fear as the underlying driver, and the other one you have love or curiosity, or a more harmonious, a more virtuous. One destroys and one builds up. And so that, I think, is the crux of what we're talking about. So in the chat, as you were alluding to, the world game idea came up. And somebody says, so we should build a world game around this. And I'm thinking, well, there are tons of world building games, but most of them run around the empire paradigm, right?
Winner take all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so to imagine what a world game would look like when it's collaborative and generative, yeah, I'd love to see that sort of fleshed out into something that I think the world is ready for that. I think we've explored all the rest of the options of winner take all and cutthroat, and you know, we've seen it all. We've played that game before. And to see what might emerge if we can even change the models of how people interact with each other and in a game world, because the gaming world, I'm playing a really basic game with my son. My son is 7, and we're playing a game called Stick Wars, and it's a set of stick figures that fight each other, and they're out to kill each other. And my wife hates the game because it's too gory. It's like stick figures have way more blood in them than they should, right? But it's also an interesting way to sort of introduce him to the concept. You have to store up resources, and then you can buy new characters, and they have different skill sets and stuff. And my son is getting all of these levels. He's like, Dad, you play this game better than me, but I know more than you. So, you know, we make a great team. But even this little basic game that I'm playing with a 7-year-old is so full of violence and so full of like dominance, and we need to protect ourselves and we need to defeat the other guy. And so to build a whole new paradigm for what's possible in collaboration and stuff, I think a game would be a great place to start that.
And the interesting thing is that there are people in the design science studio who are designing games that are actually, in one case, one of the people who is part of the Living Systems Collaboratory, Lawrence Curry Clark, I believe his last name is, he is creating a game where he's drawing from the way you can map resources onto the globe using Uber's model for being able to map where everything is moving within their visualization of where their maybe motion resources are navigating. Well, what if you can take that same idea of mapping resources and think about yourself as part of a local neighborhood, and then part of a community, and then part of a larger social system that is supporting all of that? And then how do you gain agency and maybe even gamify the process of how do you collaborate with your neighbors to effectively change your neighborhood to be way more regenerative. And then another member, Paolo Gregory, he's come up with a game called Cojado, and it's using also the ideas of sharing resources and collaborating effectively together so that very little is going to be wasted in that process. So it's really amazing to just watch that happening. And if you want to try out the Cojado game, it's part of the Topia world. So just look for some game pieces and something called Cojado, and that will portal you into another Miro board where he's going to demonstrate that.
That's awesome. Great thing. Do you the Topia world is the link for that then? Like that's how people would get into that? If you wanted to throw in a link to that more specifically, that might be helpful.
I gotta say, Topia is fun.
It's neat, right?
Yeah. And I hear that you have ambitious plans to make it even more immersive in future iterations. Is that correct?
What I've heard is that there are people who have experience in developing three-dimensional worlds. So Bonnie DeVarco, who was one of our speakers during or conversationalists in the last session, she has been working in three-dimensional spaces, curating new kinds of ways of navigating interactive worlds like that. So yeah, there's a lot of those sorts of capabilities within the team. So the challenge then is how do we manifest that in so little time if we're doing this in March?
Well, it can iterate in a lot of different ways.
That's right.
But yeah, it's interesting because then when you talk about building these little neighborhoods and you build larger and larger circles, that it goes back to the idea of education, which I know, Stephen, you're talking about a lot. This makes me think of Daniel Tiger's neighborhood, because I'm a dad too. My son's 8, my daughter's 2, and they do such a good job on PBS of building this idea of emotional intelligence, this idea of knowing the people in your life and how those roles, how to give care, how to interact in a way that's harmonious. And I think it ripples out. I was thinking about your circle, and I was thinking about the fact that the cube in the middle is the different facets of experience, because you got the inner world and the outer world, and you've got matter and how things influence you, and then what transpires ripples down the wave in the pond. What starts here ripples out. And I've been a real big fan of this idea of world change starts with you, because you're the only one, I'm the only one that I can affect, like in an individual level. And then by changing that, it then can ripple out to the people in my neighborhood, the people in my family, the people around. And just like, what you're doing here with this work, you're sort of attracting people who are on that same wavelength. And it's like, those ripples hit, and then you might influence someone, Stephen, that you didn't even know was completely inspired by your work. I just did an interview with a man who interviewed Brian Eno. And the last thing that Brian said to him in this interview that he did was, pick one thing and stay there, like work on it and make your contribution. It was amazing how these ripples like connected in ways that I'm sure people don't think about.
It's hard to keep all of those plates spinning on our mind, right? All of the ways that our own influences become influential through us, right?
Right. So one of the things that Bucky was talking about is there's a limit to the way that we can perceive the world. We can only see a small fraction of all the data that's coming in. We actually have to fine tune our perceptions to maybe focus on the visual data coming in. In this case, we're maybe focusing more on the auditory information that's coming in so that we can make sure that we're tracking with this conversation. But it also helps to have a visual. So there's a sense that we're having some little bit of connection through the visual, eye contact, and being able to read facial gestures. So there's a lot of things that are coming in that we need to process, and that means a lot of that bandwidth is being, basically just put to the side. I can't deal with that much information, so I need to focus on a certain frequency, in the same way that you might tune a radio and you can't bring in the full bandwidth of that entire radio spectrum all at once. So you tune to a specific channel on that radio frequency to be able to take in that information, be able to process it, and then maybe even respond to it.
Yeah, it makes me think of your chart. And as I was digesting it over the last, I don't know, 6 weeks, just thinking about the fact that you have the arrows going on the circle. And so to start to think about all these interconnections multidimensionally. So you've got the center, which is cube, and there's probably something on the other faces that we can't see. And if you kind of expand your mind, I mean, let's just go to the dimension of time. So some of these things, the matter happens, and as you're talking about stimulus, and then what happens in here and then leads to the response. There's a time factor to that. And so these other dimensions interact with each other in ways that do resemble the nested systems that you're talking about. And we cannot become aware of all of them at once. So it's interesting to kind of see it laid out and think about it, because it gives you a chance to theorize and think about the interactions in a way that is hard to, it's hard to see when this thing over here somehow got to this thing over here, but you're in design, you're making these choices here that have these almost, hopefully intended consequences. Hopefully you've designed for what's going to happen, but a lot of times things just sort of happen because you don't understand that the technology that we're creating is creating these other things. So again, starting from the right model of how you're educating people in UX design to start from a harmonization as opposed to colonization, as you were talking about. That's what I think is most profound about this. But I wanted to ask about that dimension and maybe some of the other dimensions like matter and energy and time. And you have these different arrows. Tell me more about that.
Sure. Well, part of that is also thinking about quantum mechanics, and what Einstein was trying to think through is, well, through his mathematics, he was able to create a prediction of, well, it seems like there's a relationship between all of these things that is not something that you can separate in the same way that, you can't separate our body and our
mind,
consciousness. You're right. If you separate any of those things, then the whole entity falls apart. So in the same way, we look at the equation speaks to, there's different properties that are creating this reality, and it's energy, it's time, it's matter, and apparently the energy is something that you can trade in a way with matter. It's sort of interchangeable, and there's a law of conservation of energy, which means it can't be destroyed. So if who we are is maybe energy manifesting through matter, it starts creating all of these ideas of like, we don't even know what we are. Are we just partly matter, partly energy, partly time? We're moving, through time and space in this very thin sliver of awareness of the present. And it's interesting how embodiment, mindfulness is taking us, like, don't worry about the future, don't obsess about the past, focus on the future, and then
on the present, right?
Or sorry, focus on the present, and then and then figure out, well, you know, if you think too far ahead, you're going to, you know, collapse into some sort of paralysis. So it's almost like, you know, are you a wave or are you a particle?
Right.
You know, are you going to cohere into some sort of lump and then hide away because you don't have the ability to flow and get into that wave mentality of, I just have to get to the next step, to the next iteration of that process that I'm part of. So let's not overthink this. And that's a big part of what we want to do as designers is, if you're thinking too big, well, I mean, it's good that you think of the entire process, but on a moment to moment, day by day basis, you have to break it down into smaller pieces that you can handle, and then go, okay, what's the next step that I have to take to actually manifest this vision into reality? So Marty Neumeier talks about this idea of what is design. Well, you know, there's that fearful place called vision, you know, where on the map it looks like there's dragons and you don't want to go there. Yeah. But then you don't want to be stuck with the status quo. Like, there's things that aren't quite right with where we are now. So
not quite right.
I might be understating that a little bit.
Yeah, you might.
Well, it's all here. Some of it's amazing and some of it's terrifying at the same time.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
One of the things,
the balance I think that I'm trying to speak to in those different models. I'm thinking of it actually as, now, if I was to create that in 3 dimensions, they would be 2 sides of the same thing, where actually the engine is driving the same way. And then, you know, which side are you focusing on? Sometimes you go to one frequency where you're focusing on, I need to get into creativity mode, so I can't let the fear overwhelm me. So I need to flip to this stage. But then if I'm at the edge of a cliff, I want to flip very quickly to, or if I'm driving and I see a threat coming towards me, I have to respond very quickly to that threat. So we kind of need that competition driver actually happening, but we need to know, when do we focus on one or the other?
I picked up on the arrows too, Steve. And one of the things that I thought about that is it implies that things are always moving.
Exactly.
We sometimes get into this mode of thinking that things are static or they're regimented
in time.
Right. They're regimented in categorical lines, right? And if you see it as a circle, then it kind of feels that way. Like there's these rings of a circle. But if you see it as an arrow, it's like, oh, everything's moving. All of this stuff is moving. And the other piece that we're drawing out, like, we are finite beings. I only have the eyes in my head to see through. And somehow that needs to seep into our collective humility, right?
Right.
So many of the problems that exist in our world exist because we thought we weren't. we thought we were infinite and we had all the control in the universe. And then we discover, like Stephen points out, there are unintended consequences all over the place. And I think if we started to embrace that kind of humility that recognizes we are going to put unintended consequences into reality, then it encourages us to walk a little more carefully, tread a little bit more lightly, and be a little bit more precious about the things that really matter.
True. And also think in different scales as you're creating new things in the world. So a big part of what we're doing with the UX design process is making sure that we're not thinking in scales of time of like maybe like a 5-year business plan. Right. We're actually thinking we only have a week to get to the next milestone. So we're going to run a 1-week design sprint. Or even thinking in terms of, like, Tom Chi was just speaking to the Design Science Studio about how, you know, when we're in a meeting and people are just throwing guesses around or conjectures is is what he calls them, about, well, we could do this or we could do that. So, brainstorming is great until it gets to the point where you're about to make a decision. And what usually happens, especially when you have very intelligent, high-powered individuals in a meeting, well, very often the decision goes to whoever has the most power or has the
Right.
title that is highest in the hierarchy, or is the best at being able to be aggressive in the way they are able to enforce their ideas. So meetings then just become guest parties rather than actually arriving at a true sense of the environment and the actual problem that you need to solve. If it all comes back to power, who gets to say which direction we're going, and then we'll just go, yep, okay, let's all do that. But then you just might be leaning your ladder against the wrong wall, or running your process in completely the wrong direction, which is, what we're doing is running a globe-sized meeting where we're all guessing about reality, but we're all deferring to the people who have power to make the decisions, rather than actually creating a prototype of what could be. In his meetings with Google X, Tom Shee was talking about how, well, we were creating Google Glass and we needed to first understand what color of light are we going to use for this heads-up display. And Sergey Brin says, well, obviously it's going to be red. And then he, at the end of an hour-and-a-half meeting, okay, well, that's the decision. We're going to go with red. And then as Tom Shee's he's walking out the door, he's like, no, that's not the answer. And we need to prototype this. And within that afternoon, they were able to go, okay, let's quickly throw something together and test what color is going to work. And by that afternoon, they knew red was actually the worst.
Yeah, red's a bad color for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of the concept that you introduced me to about rapid prototyping. And I know most people here are involved with the Buckminster Fuller Institute. So these are concepts that I'm new to, and they stand out because the idea that rather than get stuck in paralysis and thinking too far ahead, you solve the problems at hand and you test them. And I think that's something we've learned from Business 2.0 in the web era, because we've started to have things like A/B split campaigns and things where we can actually see what is the actual result in the real world with this. But like you said in the other workshop about Buckminster himself, Fuller himself, is the idea that you want to start out at the macro, because you don't want to be coming at a problem myopically. So it's this interesting tension between both and in these approaches, where you're able to sort of zoom out and then go, okay, what are we doing? Let's test that. Let's look at the limits of our perception. Let's, kind of see. And I think that's about, honestly, blending science and design, to be quite honest.
Right.
It's about, you want to have the vision to know, and we would like to build a better world. We would like utopia. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what we're trying to solve, or here's what we'd like to experience. But then the science of it is actually going in and testing it, and testing that hypothesis, and going into the micro level and seeing, well, is this actually what it does? And is this actually, and then, I think your levels of experience help you keep in mind these nested systems of every system is affecting another system. So it may work great in theory, but then it might, fall when it goes to product, because no one knows about it. And so that's where it's interesting, because you're right. It is this other side of the coin. There's this sort of push-pull between art and commerce. And there's this push-pull between, I really think of the yin yang in terms of, I've been really contemplative about how I spend my time. And one of the things I notice is that if I don't get enough quiet time, enough yin, then I overdo it and I start to burn out. And it's like, there are times where the only amount of action is this little bit of white in the black. And that's what it takes to move something forward. And there are other times where you need massive, coordinated, focused action. And that yang, and really, it's an important thing at times. Like you said, oh, someone's going to crash into me. I better yank that wheel. And it's this constant, it's this constant tension. It's this constant ebb and flow. And what you said, Brad, about thinking of it as moving.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone's seen a yin yang. If you just think of it as this like static thing, you can conceptualize it and whatever. But actually, if you think of it like Tai Chi,
right,
and
like it's flowing.
It's flowing, it's moving. There's a push, there's a pull, there's a wave, and then everybody knows that the judo of it is actually, well, no, actually, don't push it. Just go, like, move it. Use the momentum of it. And so that was the other concept that really stuck out to me as a neophyte to this, was the idea of building on top of existing systems to eventually make them obsolete. So it's like you don't just erase, 2 or 3, 4,000 years of history and go, well, we're just going to throw that out the window. Let's reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah.
So it's this idea, and and this is the last point I have to make, is this kind of what you alluded to earlier, is we're on this biosphere together. So people who are in the fear paradigm are not going to respond well to you saying, oh, well, that's bunk, and we're just going to come and change it all. They're just going to go and put up their walls and make all their guns and just, start shooting at you. And you're like, okay, how are you going to get anything done with that? Right. So like I said, there are only about 10% or 5% of actual, I'm just pulling these numbers out of my memory, of actual people are sociopaths. Most people have some moral compass. So it's like working with those people and getting them on board with like, hey, the water's nice in here. Let's, oh, wow, I really like that. The way this looks, the way this feels, and oftentimes that's how you kind of bring people in toward a new way of thinking. You want to bridge that gap.
Right, exactly.
The old paradigm and the new. And that's one of the things I really love about Bucky. It's like everybody can go, wow, that's cool.
He's really winsome, isn't he? There's just something about the way that he thinks and then presents his thinking that just draw you in. And it's remarkable. You've made a whole bunch of really cool points there about how control exists and the tension between freedom and control, right? We need systems that coordinate action when we need to collaborate at scale. But what does that mean for the individual? And I think we're at an interesting juncture in history because there is so much that's being deconstructed right now. And by deconstructed, I'm with you, Steve. It's not about tearing it down, but it's about asking all the important questions that if it is the only structure, you don't even have the ability to ask questions. You don't even have the vocabulary for it, right? And here we are entering this time where all of this is up for grabs again, afresh, and we get to cherry pick, if I can use that, from a much broader kind of source of history, and we can examine it, but we need to have some kind of cohesive values that we do that with. And that's the interesting thing about this. But I think I'm with you in the sense that the percentage of people who will just not get on board with this, or who will oppose it because that's the way they're wired, is very small. And the stuff that's possible is really winsome if it's presented the right way. And what I appreciate about the whole thing that preceded this, the whole day and presentation, is there's such a huge diversity of actions and a huge diversity of tangible manifestations, but it's coming from compatible intentionality. There's enough grounding that you can see these people are on the same page. They're going the same direction, but they're not getting there the same way. And they're totally honoring each other in that, right? It's not like, well, you should do it my way. Everybody should be a game designer, or everybody should be a whatever. And you've talked about religious closed systems and abusive, toxic environments. And I resonate with that. And that's something else that's being massively and very rapidly deconstructed. And it's fascinating to watch what that's doing in the cultural landscape. And a whole bunch of people are waking up to a new reality that they were controlled by something that was inappropriate and untrustworthy, where trust was just assumed. And now there's a big population that is ready for this whole awakening that's being talked about, but it can't be through an overexertion of control, because that's what they're recovering from, right? It's got to be working with the intentions that are compatible and resonate.
And speaking of world building, right? I love playing Sid Meier's Civilization, and one of the things that they assert is that on your tree of technologies, religious fundamentalism becomes one of them. Yep. Right? So ideological fundamentalism, because let's not pick on religion, it has its place, of any kind. It could be political fundamentalism. It could be, fundamental football fundamentalism. It has the ability to get a large number of people on board with a certain set of ideas, or you name things. There's a dogma to it, and that becomes a cohesive design thinking. I mean, you talk about the Bauhaus. To bring it into a more positive framework, you can create a set of shared core beliefs, as you mentioned too, Brad, that you can use to unify and move forward in a direction. And so without any sense of unity, you can't really accomplish anything. So it's about knowing how to, zoom in and zoom out on those subset of core shared understandings. For example, like, I don't need to have game developer code level of understanding to communicate with you guys about making a world building game. But if we were actually trying to code it, I'd have to read myself into that world to be of any use at all. And so I think this idea of interlocking parts that are different but cohesive, that can, and that's why I think the dimensional thinking is helpful, because, sorry about my background, I'm very, very backlit.
It's giving you a halo. You are now, the voice.
But that's why I think this interdimensional thinking is helpful. If we can kind of relate this mental model of quantum physics or quantum gravity, as you were talking about, Stephen, to our interpersonal relationships and our social systems thinking, we can think about what kind of person do we need here for this project? What kind of ingredient do we need to bring to this pie that we're making? And that's a really important part of, I think what you're rapid prototyping with this group and Design Science Studio, and having people collaborating from all around the world. And as we kind of talked about on our episode, Stephen, about the internet being this really great thing that has suddenly brought together a wider array of interests without regard to physical location. So now the opportunities for solving these problems in a more open source way exists. You don't need as much structure. Like, we didn't need to rent a building to have this thing. You probably would have had to founded a corporation to get the cash flow to found a building. And now that can exist open source software, right? Yep. Everybody's working from their house, and there's no need for a brickwork as much in that sense. So that opens up it democratizes the structure of the organization. Let's face it. I mean, some of the organizational challenges we have exist for a reason. We see it at churches, we see it in corporations, we see it in PTA meetings, we see it everywhere. The same design challenges that happen when people groups gather together and do things are consistent across groups. So if we look at that as a design challenge, I think that's a really good thing to think about. A lot of progress has been made there too already. So
yeah, that's true. And injecting some of that other awareness, the alter-centrism, into those groups, I think would be really essential, because that's the key that's sometimes missing. Those individual groups become self-absorbed, and we're going to do it our way, and we know where that goes. Like, it goes to war, whether it's factions of kids on a high school playground or continents. We're really good at devolving things to the point where it's an armed conflict. But instead to inject the ultracentrism and to say our center of gravity is not just ourselves, right? We're working toward a bigger thing, and the collective sense of love, of empathy, of connection, that puts us in a better framework where all of these things can have a more generative existence, and they can take us in more positive directions. So yeah, it's a learning project for sure. That's steering a whole culture in a different direction.
Well, also the question it was just asked was about how to do that. Let's see, what would be a natural way for people to come together and move together? I instantly think of the hyperlocal movement.
Yep.
So, for example, community gardens.
Mhm.
And so I almost feel like that's like the mesh net of people in society. It's like if we start thinking small again, then we can band together, weave, as someone put it in one of the other session in the notes, is like weave together this experience that is a tapestry of people and groups that can sort of find their own little existence, because there is a law of numbers. I think in groups it's like anything after 12, it's like, you have a group of 3, then you have a group of 12, and I think that then it breaks into like I mean, I know the military knows this really well. It breaks into like numbers of 10,000 and 144,000. There's certain points where group dynamics change, so that part's known. So it's like the hyperlocal movement is, let's do local, sustainable, and we can support each other and know each other and create community. And so you find naturally those ebb and flows. And then as far as how to scale that across the internet, I mean, I know open source has done good work around that. I know there's a lot of other examples of that, but the question would be, or actually that's just what I kind of want to throw out, is just a peace crumb answer to your question, because that's what I see as the place to look, maybe for that example of life doing something generative. I think you could also apply that to small groups of people doing hyperlocal. Could be a great petri dish for observation of how does this actually work? How could we learn from this?
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, the idea of being local, it's reminding me of a project around a water museum that is one of the things that there's a 2 people who are working on that, and well, probably way more, but within the Design Science Studio, they're presenting on how water becomes a way of thinking about, well, where's that energy coming from? How is that flowing through a particular environment? Thinking of our local watershed and how the earth is using water as a way of distributing energy, distributing nutrients. All these different systems are really revolving around this idea. And is there a way of then thinking of ourselves as a kind of local weather system, that affects a particular area, and thinking of ourselves as maybe going back to a way of tying ourselves to a particular area of life, because we're committed to our neighbors, our more than human neighbors. We all come from this tradition where we've revered this sacred text that talks about how, love your neighbor, and what does that actually mean? So the idea of love gets watered down by the society, but it also starts to question, well, who's our neighbor? The ones outside of that imaginary border that we create for our nation state, or does it go much more to, well, even whose land is this anyway? and who's neighboring who? Whom are we squatting on someone else's land, claiming it to be our own, taking all the resources, and then wondering, well, so how do we as designers come in here with all the solutions? well, maybe it's time to actually think about how do we learn how to listen to even the people in our environment, but also, did we know that there were trees and mycelium talking with each other? No. Until very recently, that was never really a thing that you would admit to anyone that you believed. You know, unless you were in Iceland and thinking of fairies, you know, that are running around. Well, maybe the fairies are real. They're called bacteria.
Maybe they are real.
Yeah.
I mean, metaphysically, how do we know? Science has proven there's so many different dimensions,
Yeah.
in terms of even just quantum realities and possibilities. And
Right.
so I think that we need to tap into a less limited idea of what is possible. I'm not saying fairies are real, but I'm also saying
Right.
that, you know, it's amazing how far-fetched things seem if you just rewind a few years, that we
Yes.
know now, right?
Yes.
So it's like, you know, the bias that exists in like, oh, hey, we already know this, versus keeping an open mind. And I think that's where art can be hugely beneficial, because you can suspend the constraints of reality that we experience in matter.
Yeah.
And you can set, that's why I love about Topia. I'm like walking around there going, here's a reality that looks like it was drawn on paper.
Yeah.
But I'm having an experience in this place, and there's certain rules that don't apply. And it's creating this whole thing, but my mind can just instantly go, okay, it's like reading a book. All right, I have a pet dragon. All right, cool, you know? And so I think that those thought experiments, can be really beneficial, because you know, again, talking about belief is like your narrative is like your operating system.
Yeah.
So you were talking
Yeah.
about the Bible, and you were talking about the creation story.
Right.
And so when you're talking to someone who comes from that narrative as a like a literal idea, well, it's not impossible to bridge the idea of ecology to them, but you have to understand there are certain underlying assumptions that may be different from your own. So, for example, the idea of authority and what that means. And so, when working with those kind of mental models, as you called them, there's a certain way they're going to use the system. And it's not inherently bad either. It's what they have, it's what they're working with. So if the user is always going to click the wrong button, then you better move the button. At some point, you can try and, okay, let me
Maybe.
teach you how to use the button. Well, that's the thing in
Maybe.
UX design, right? There's a couple choices, right? Do you move the button, or you teach them how to use the button? And the
Yeah.
question becomes is like, you know, when there's harm to a system, or there's something that's happening that's unintended, it's like, how do you design a more um, uh, well-designed system to help use human behaviors and naturally occur. I mean, wolves are going to hunt. So there are naturally occurring human behaviors that arise out of these stories that we have. So it's almost like that's where I think the place is for reform in design, in religion, and these things. Is you want to learn how to, you know, sort of work with these systems, and like a gardener would prune, you know, let's get that tree to grow in a way that's not going to bind the roots so much. Let's not try and make this thing go away. I mean, there are times where you have to cut things out, but then again, when do you become the person, you know, with the wall and the gun saying, no, this is, you know,
Yeah.
so it's a real design challenge for one thing, but it's a perspective challenge as well. I mean, how do I accept the other? How do I accept someone who thinks, you know, that it's okay to oppress, or that it's a, you know, it's I think they ended up there somehow. I don't think it's right. I don't think that we should accept that and design for that, but I think that, you know, I tend to look at people as like, well, you're a product of your system, you're a
Right.
product of your upbringing, you're a product of your life experience, you're a product of your stories. And so that's where I think art fits in, is like, you know, how to tell better stories, but mainly like, what do we get to experience when we free our mind from constraints of, you know, our lived reality, and we can actually go into a different viewpoint for a minute, just to try it on, just to explore and walk around and see what happens. And that might spawn some sort of other idea or other perspective, or in this case of this diagram, this multidimensional, oh, it's moving. Like,
Right. One of the things that I've noticed about the way the world is operating right now is that we've kind of narrowed the road and enlarged the ditches. And what I mean by that is, if somebody feels like they're tracking in our in-group and all of a sudden they say something that just sounds a little bit wrong, they're out, right? They're in the ditch, they're done. And what I appreciate about what you're saying is we need to have an appropriately sized road. We need to grow the road because there's lots of stuff that can be done that isn't dangerous, right? And our assumptions of danger are easily triggered. But there are still ditches. And so, I mean, you use the analogy of a wolf hunts. Okay, that's cool, but I don't want my neighbor to hunt. Right? I want there to be some kind of restrictions and some kind of limitations, but recognizing that the way that our structure is, because there's so many different influences that are taking cultural hold, and our culture has become fragmented, it becomes flinty, and it becomes there's just way too much hyper vigilance, and that is really dangerous. It's just impossible to have a cohesive, leadable, generative society if everybody is just in that sort of permanent suspicious mode about everybody, even the people who are close to me. And so we have to grow a comfort level and ground ourselves in what matters. And that's why I think intentionality is so key. Getting that intention into the culture, into the education system, getting it where it resonates with people. And not trying to force it, because that's not going to work. We've seen that, but the influence and the awareness and the curiosity and invitation into that, I think, is so key to me.
Stephen, you were talking about mycelium. I'm sorry, I tangented for you.
Not at all. Yeah. Well, I'm just noticing that there are people leaving the group. Just we have been speaking for a while, so I just wanted to recognize. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I think what I'm going to do is maybe, if I can, leave the Miro board open so that people can interact with it and maybe build it into the kind of museum that I was thinking of for the Bauhaus, but also being a collaborative space to think through how do we use this as a workshop. So I was hoping that, yeah, maybe we can, it might be a little long if we engage people in that right now, but maybe we can open it up to ask people who are here, did you want to maybe think through how do we interact with this mental model? Because the idea was, well, how does it become a workshop? How does it become a worksheet that you can think through? Here's where we are. What are the habits that are driving my intentions? How can I change the way that's working in a way where, we make small little adjustments in our habits, and then it has a way of having an impact on other people who are in our social spheres. And that's how we become maybe more aware of, it's not about designing things or artifacts or apps, or like, it's actually designing who are we? How do we change our habits? How do we manifest something different in the world unless we change?
And the responsibility is given back to each of us to do that for ourselves, right? We trust the mix of intuition and intellect that we have, and we're given that freedom and invitation to live into who we are better in the midst of community that's all on that same journey, right? It's not people who are coming from a real top down, like, this is how it is and this is how it needs to be, but it's just that operating together, co-creating, collaborating, right?
Right, exactly. So maybe this, let's see who's left.
Well, Kiki just left, but she also said that she wanted to know if she could use your model in her paper.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, and I know you know Kiki, so
I can, yeah,
you can
definitely
talk to her about that.
direct that.
Yeah, I agree. Why don't we
Yeah.
open it up and make it like a Socratic dialogue?
Sure, sure.
I want to say something, thank you guys. And I was so surprised because I was just exploring the Bauhaus things, just like framing a new way to create like an university or something. When we learn about design and art, and also like human things like anthropology and sociology. And I think it's so great. It's a great material. And I'm in Argentina. I'm from Colombia, and in Spanish we don't find so much information about this in this way. Like, so if you want, I could translate that, and also, I don't know, sharing things here in the South.
Wow, yeah, that would be amazing. I would definitely welcome that opportunity. Thank you. Yeah. Maybe you can, I can share my email address and we can collaborate together on that. Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll be connecting more through Design Science Studio as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So one of the things that I wanted to share just about, I only shared 2 of the models that I had created because I first wanted to maybe start with how do I understand myself and how do I fit into a larger social system. But I thought this would be a really interesting way for people to maybe, instead of thinking about how do I run a survey and gather data around demographics and purchasing habits or ways that people work with products and that sort of thing. But then maybe we can go really to the core of who a person is and really understand, is there a way that we can, as a society, work together effectively to manifest really generative, regenerative intentions in the world? And what would it take to do that? So I think it would start with personal habits of resilience to know where we need to maybe think of ourselves as people who have agency in the world and can make decisions and can affect our environment in really amazing ways. And I think what we're seeing within this little group is just that ability to communicate and then think of new things and then what's next. So I love what you and Ruta are working on in your collaboration, just recognizing we're all the same. And that's
it's so organic, like we meet each other in another course, like in science, psychology, science psychology. I don't remember the name. And but it was like that, like, oh, hi, how are you? And we're all designers, and we have like our own projects about creativity, and just talk about it, like we connect and talk like 3 times, and then same idea came out, and just prototype something. And today's presentation was great because it's like, okay, this is gonna work.
Yeah.
And we're doing it. Yeah.
I'm so glad you could be part of our gathering.
Yeah.
And I would really like to know, well, how can we support your project? As your, one of the pieces was, we've got 2 people on different sides of the world, but your aspiration is 195 countries and representations in each of them. So do you know what the next step is for that?
Well, we are just doing the website and inviting friends, but maybe I have friends in Latin America, and Ruth, I have friends in Europe, but we don't know, for example, people in Africa or Oceania or Canada or yeah, there are a lot of countries that we don't know, and we don't know how to go to another kind of people, you know.
Right.
I think that's well, I don't remember the word, but our limitation, maybe.
Yeah. Well, maybe just in this little conversation, some things are coming to mind about how, well, if you can translate what I'm working on, and maybe we work on whether, does this make sense to everybody before we start rolling it out to the entire world? Let's start making little collaborations about how would you run a workshop. And I know Ruta, that's kind of what she does, is she helps people with technologies and helps to create strategies around being able to use them effectively to communicate and connect with people. So maybe this becomes a way of extending what you're doing by creating an understanding that, well, yeah, maybe we are all the same, but we just maybe have different biases or different ways of reacting to different stimulus or different environmental factors. But if we recognize that it's really running on the same engine, well, maybe we just get to know each other better, and then we can see how we collaborate more effectively.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see some of these other models. And if anyone comes up with their own models, because this is apparently, you can apply these circles to different centers.
Exactly. So the idea was that there are things that we can't change in the world. So those are things that are hard coded onto the page. In the you know, there's a, if you read the article, there's a choose your own adventure model, which has a lot of blanks in it, and then you can fill in like, well, who am I? What are my intentions? How is that working out into the way I work in the world? And so I was focusing primarily on me as a designer and how I'm working with other designers to mentor them, just so they could see themselves as a whole. But this was actually being designed so that it could work with dancers or musicians, or it could be anybody.
Yeah, I think everything is connected, because instead of saying, for example, I'm a designer too, a visual designer, and here I run my own project called, like in English is something like creator instinct, instinto creador is in Spanish. And that's the point, you know, like talking about creativity, like the force that moves us. Instead, we are designers, artists, musicians, actors. We have like the same force for doing what we are doing, and we're going to the same world view at a point. So yeah,
interesting. As you were sharing that, I was even thinking, well, even if we were going to translate this idea so that other people could collaborate with it or work with it, what if we even thought of ourselves as, you know, all these nested systems, and then we could even apply the model to the different organisms that are trying to do things within our own systems. So that's where I'm wondering, as I'm working in the Living Systems Collaboratory and the Design Science Studio, the project that I'm working on is how do we navigate metaphysical gravity? So it's something that every living being is really navigating, both gravity and how do I, as a being, we just had a grandchild this year, and we're sad that we won't see our grandchild over Christmas. But what I'm doing as part of this work is, how do I create a world that's going to work for my own child and grandchild and my son-in-law? It's thinking through, well, there's there's all these different relationships that I have with the people and the living systems of the world. So it's, how do I maybe work as a designer over here, but over here I'm a father, I have a wife. Those are other social systems that come into the circle in a lot of different ways. And so the model I was thinking of as almost like atoms bouncing up against each other in a really complex system. Anyway, yeah, it looks like Brad and Steve, you're about to go. So maybe what
No,
we can
I'm not
do...
saying bye. I'm saying hello to Brad's kid.
Oh, I see. All right. I just saw hands waving. I was like, oh no, something's
I'm sure
going on.
kid has a name.
Yeah.
Yes, I said it, but I was muted. This is Julian.
Yeah.
Julian.
And Julian just lost a tooth.
Oh,
amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was kind of already a bit off. It was a bit like this.
It was a bit loose and then a bit crooked, and then it finally came out.
Kind of, yeah, it got pushed out a little bit. Wow. That's exciting.
It wasn't as ready as this one.
Yeah, so that's his third tooth this week.
Wow.
It felt way better than this one. It hurts a bit.
It hurts a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't as ready to come out as the rest of my teeth. And the tooth near this tooth. What else is the tooth? like the biggest tooth. Like the biggest tooth. It I actually have 2 adult teeth.
That's right. You've got 2 adult teeth, and now you've lost almost.
Thanks for sharing, Brad. Nice to meet you.
But
and now we're going to come full circle to the discussion of fairies, because, well, is the tooth fairy coming to compensate this?
Just hang on.
Okay. Anyway, maybe what we should do, just so, I just want to thank everyone for being part of this discussion, and I love that we've had this sort of free-ranging discussion about the model, but also an interesting presentation, and some connections that hopefully we can move into the future. So I love that you and Brad and Steve, that you have both been able to join me here in being able to discuss these ideas. So hopefully this is just the beginning of more discussions to come, because I think I really love what's happening here. And
yeah, now is this Design for Resilience, Brad? Is Brad a part of Design for Resilience podcast?
Yeah.
Right.
Amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, that was the only other thing I wanted to plug for you, Stephen, was that your concept of designing for resilience, because looking at the Bauhaus and what happened when they were spread out, you have to design for things to go wrong. And what do we do when that happens? So you've talked to me about the podcast you'd like to start called Design for Resilience. And I'm very, very, very excited to hear it. So I can't wait for you guys to get that going.
Well,
yeah, we're excited to hear it too.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for drawing me into this conversation too, Stephen. This has been an amazing experience for me, and watching all of the inspiring people who are connected to this. And it's been great.
And yeah, I think what we do with this talk is this becomes maybe a starting point for, does this become the first episode where we actually weave all these ideas together into something a little bit more, edited, cohesive, and then but also pointing to how people can maybe start to engage with these ideas, debunk them maybe. Yeah, I'm open to the possibility that I could be wrong here, and this model is not really reflective of reality, but that's kind of the point, is to put it out there and to test it. And that's how we do want to design for resilience. So thank you for plugging that. And yeah, hopefully that's going to be coming soon with some audio equipment coming for Christmas.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Malu.
Amazing.
And,
this was enjoyable.
Yeah. And
nice to meet you.
Hello, Moni.
And hi, Moni.
You're still there. Thank you for joining us as well. And we're going to sign off now, just so I think we're excited to dive back into Utopia, but also just to take a well-needed break. That was a long day.
I'll see you guys in Topia a little while from now.
Okay.
Yeah, don't forget to eat.
Yeah.
Bye for now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.